The northern frontier was a place where civilization frayed at the edges, where the forests grew so dense that sunlight became a precious commodity, filtered through ancient canopies in thin golden threads. Here, in the shadow of the Thornpeak Mountains, humanity clung to existence in scattered settlements, always aware of the boundary between their world and the realm of the immortals. The vampires ruled the night with absolute dominion, their courts hidden in magnificent obsidian citadels that rose from the mountainsides like jagged teeth piercing the sky. For centuries, an uneasy truce had held. Humans kept to their daylight territories, and the blood drinkers maintained their nocturnal sovereignty. But truces, like all things built on fear rather than understanding, are fragile constructions that shatter at the slightest provocation. Matthias Blackwood had never intended to become entangled in the affairs of the immortal courts. He was a woodsman, a hunter, a man who had chosen solitude over society after the plague had taken his family 12 years prior. His cabin stood in a clearing 3 days' journey from the nearest village, built with his own hands from timber he had felled and stone he had quarried. It was a modest structure, but it was his, a sanctuary where he could live according to his own terms, beholden to no lord and subject to no law except the fundamental codes of survival that governed the wilderness. The cabin had thick walls to keep out the winter cold, a stone hearth that could warm the single room, and shutters reinforced with iron bars, because even in isolation, one did not forget that monsters were real. On this particular autumn night, the air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. Matthias had returned from checking his traplines as dusk settled over the forest, his pack heavy with the pelts of rabbits and one particularly fine fox whose russet fur would fetch a good price when he made his quarterly journey to trade. He had built up the fire, set water to boil for tea, and was skinning his catch when he heard it, a sound that did not belong to the natural nocturnal symphony of the woods. It was not the howl of wolves or the screech of an owl. It was something between a sob and a gasp, human in its desperation but carrying an otherworldly resonance that made the hair on the back of his neck stand upright. Matthias was not a reckless man. Survival in the wilderness required caution, calculation, and a healthy respect for the unknown. But he was also not without compassion, and the sound spoke of genuine distress. He set down his skinning knife, wiped his hands on a rag and took up his hunting bow, a weapon he kept strung and ready at all times. The crossbar on his door was solid oak, 3 inches thick, and he lifted it with practiced ease before stepping out into the darkening evening. The forest was already deep in twilight, that liminal hour when the day creatures retreated and the night hunters emerged. His eyes, accustomed to reading tracks and spotting game, scanned the treeline with methodical precision. For a moment there was nothing. Then movement, a flash of dark fabric, the pale gleam of skin, and 2 figures stumbling from between the trees like shipwreck survivors reaching shore. They were young women, or appeared to be, their ages difficult to determine in the failing light. What was immediately apparent was their state of distress. Their clothing was torn and muddied, hanging from their frames in tatters that spoke of a desperate flight through hostile terrain. One was supporting the other, who appeared injured, limping badly. Matthias's first instinct was to call out, to offer assistance. His second instinct, the one honed by years of frontier survival, held him silent. There was something not quite right about the scene. The women moved with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with their apparent injuries. Their skin, even in the dim light, possessed a luminous quality too perfect, too unmarred by the branches and thorns that had shredded their garments. And their eyes, when they turned toward him, caught the last rays of sunset and reflected it back in a way that human eyes did not. The realization struck him like a physical blow. Vampires. The legends and the reality of vampires had diverged over the centuries. Campfire stories painted them as mindless monsters, all slavering fangs and insatiable bloodlust. The truth, as Matthias understood it from the rare travelers who passed through these remote regions, was more complex and far more dangerous. Vampires were intelligent, cultured, and possessed of powers that made them apex predators in the truest sense. They had laws, hierarchies, and a strict code of conduct that governed their interactions with humanity. The truce held because the vampire courts enforced it with draconian efficiency. Any vampire who broke the peace and fed without sanction faced final death at the hands of their own kind. But these 2 were not attacking. They were fleeing. The one who appeared less injured spoke, and her voice was like music played on crystal strings, beautiful and alien. "Please," she said, and the single word carried layers of meaning, desperation, pride forced to bend, and a plea that cost her dearly to utter. "We mean no harm. We seek only shelter. Just until the dawn." Every survival instinct Matthias possessed screamed at him to retreat into his cabin, bar the door, and wait for whatever nightmare was unfolding to pass him by. Involvement in the affairs of immortals was a death sentence for mortals. There were no exceptions, no happy endings in those tales. But as he looked at the two figures before him, at the genuine fear in their luminous eyes and the way the injured one's strength was clearly failing, he found himself facing a different kind of choice. Not the calculated decision of a survivor, but the fundamental test of character that defined what kind of man he truly was. "Inside," he said, the word leaving his mouth before his rational mind could stop it. Quickly. They moved with speed that blurred the edges of their forms, and suddenly they were on his threshold. The uninjured one, and he could see now that she was stunningly beautiful in the way that vampires were, with features too perfect to be human, paused at the doorway. "You must invite us," she said. "The threshold is sacred. We cannot cross without your permission." Another fragment of vampire lore proven true. Matthias nodded, his grip tight on his bow, though he knew it would be useless if they meant him harm. "I invite you into my home. Enter freely and of your own will." The old formula, remembered from childhood tales his grandmother had told. They crossed the threshold and the injured one immediately collapsed. Matthias's training as a hunter, which included basic knowledge of treating wounds, kicked in automatically. He set aside his bow and moved to examine her. The injury was a deep gash along her side, and the blood that seeped from it was darker than human blood, almost black in the firelight. But what shocked him was that the wound was not healing. Vampire flesh was supposed to regenerate with supernatural speed, yet this injury remained open, the edges of the torn flesh looking almost burned. "Silver blade," the standing vampire explained, kneeling beside her companion. "Coated with mountain ash extract. It prevents regeneration. The wound will heal eventually but slowly, and only if she has proper rest and—" She hesitated, and Matthias understood what she could not bring herself to ask. "Blood?" he finished. "She needs blood to heal." The vampire woman's eyes met his and he saw shame there, mixed with defiance. "We have not fed. We would not break the truce no matter our circumstances. We will endure." Matthias moved to his cabinet, pulling out his kit of medical supplies. He had needle and thread for suturing, alcohol for cleaning wounds, and strips of clean linen for bandaging. As he worked, cleaning the injury with a gentleness that seemed to surprise his unexpected guests, he asked the question that needed asking. "Who did this to you? And why are they hunting you?" The vampire woman was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of a story that had been building for far longer than this single night. "My name is Serafina," she said. "This is my sister Evangeline. We are the daughters of Queen Carmilla, sovereign of the Crimson Court and ruler of all the night territories from the Thorn Peaks to the Shadow Marches. And we are being hunted because we refuse to marry." The name Carmilla struck Matthias like a thunderclap. Even in his isolation, he had heard tales of the vampire queen, a monarch of such power and ferocity that other immortals spoke her name with a mixture of reverence and terror. She had ruled for over 1,000 years, had seen empires rise and crumble to dust, and maintained her dominion through a combination of strategic brilliance and absolute ruthlessness. And these were her daughters. "Explain," Matthias said, continuing his work on Evangeline's wound. The gash was deep but clean, and though his usual remedies would not work as they would on human flesh, he could at least close the wound and bind it properly. The silver contamination would have to work its way out naturally. Serafina's tale unfolded like a dark ballad, each word weighted with centuries of tradition and the burden of immortal politics. The vampire courts, she explained, maintained their power through carefully arranged alliances, marriages that bound houses together and created networks of loyalty that transcended individual ambition. Queen Carmilla had ruled alone since the death of her consort 300 years prior, but she had always intended her daughters to continue the lineage, to secure the future of the Crimson Court through strategic unions with other powerful vampire houses. The problem, Serafina continued with a bitter edge to her musical voice, was that neither she nor Evangeline had any interest in becoming political pawns. They had been raised as warriors, trained in combat and strategy, educated in the arts of governance and diplomacy. They were not simpering princesses content to be bartered like livestock. When their mother had announced the impending marriages to twin princes from the Obsidian Dominion, a powerful but brutal house known for its archaic views on female vampires, the sisters had objected. Not gently, not diplomatically, but with the full force of their considerable wills. The queen's response had been both shocking and entirely in keeping with her reputation for dramatic gestures. She had declared a wedding hunt, an ancient tradition that had not been invoked in over 5 centuries. The daughters would be given a 3-day head start to flee anywhere within the territories of the Crimson Court. If they could evade capture until dawn on the 4th day, they would earn the right to refuse the arranged marriages and choose their own fates. But if they were caught, they would submit to their mother's will without further protest, and the marriages would proceed immediately. And if we fled beyond the boundaries of her territory, Serafina added, her hands clenched into fists, we would be declared renegades, stripped of our titles and protections, and hunted by every vampire house as outlaws. Our mother is nothing if not thorough in closing off escape routes. Evangeline stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Despite the pain she was clearly experiencing, her first words were not a complaint but a bitter laugh. And we were doing so well too. Made it 2 full nights without being spotted. But the Obsidian Princes themselves joined the hunt, and they brought their hunt master, a tracker with 500 years of experience. When we realized they had found our trail, we tried to lose them in the Thornwood River. That's when they caught up to us. We fought. She gestured to her wound. One of them fights very dirty. We've been running since sunset, Serafina continued. They're less than an hour behind us. We saw your cabin light and, she shrugged, a gesture that encompassed desperation, hope, and the abandonment of pride. We had nowhere else to go. If we die, at least it will be as warriors, not as breeding stock for an alliance we never wanted. Matthias finished binding Evangeline's wound and sat back on his heels, his mind racing through scenarios and possibilities. The sensible thing would be to send them back out into the night immediately, to avoid becoming entangled in immortal politics. But even as he thought it, he knew he would not do so. Perhaps it was stubborn human contrariness, or perhaps something in their story had resonated with him, the fight for autonomy, the refusal to accept a fate dictated by others. He had chosen isolation over society for similar reasons after all. You can stay until dawn, he said finally. I'll not turn out wounded refugees regardless of what they are. But understand this, if your hunters come here, I will not lie for you. I've no desire to start a war with vampire royalty. Serafina's eyes widened, and something that might have been gratitude flickered across her perfect features. You would risk this for us? You must know that even harboring us could be seen as taking sides. My mother does not forgive perceived slights. Then we'll hope your hunters don't find you here, Matthias replied, with a calmness he did not entirely feel. Rest now. Both of you need to conserve your strength. Dawn is still 6 hours away. He had no sooner spoken than the temperature in the cabin dropped precipitously. The fire in the hearth guttered and dimmed, the flames turning from warm orange to pale blue. Outside, the night sounds of the forest ceased abruptly, as if every creature had simultaneously decided to hold its breath. And then came the sound of wings, not the soft flutter of bird or bat, but the deep, powerful beats of something massive cutting through the air with the force of a storm. The cabin door, which Matthias had barred after admitting the sisters, exploded inward. Not ripped off its hinges, but simply disintegrated into splinters and dust, as if a force of pure will had decided its existence was no longer required. And in the doorway, backlit by a crimson aura that seemed to emanate from her very being, stood Queen Carmilla. She was terrifying and magnificent in equal measure. Taller than any human woman, her frame nonetheless possessed perfect proportions that human sculptors spent lifetimes trying to capture in marble and never quite achieved. Her armor was a masterwork of blood-red metal that seemed to shift and flow like liquid in the light, adorned with ancient runes that hurt to look at directly. A crown of black thorns and crimson gems sat upon her head, and from her back spread wings of shadow and membrane, vast and powerful, their span too wide for the cabin doorway so that they remained half-folded behind her like a cloak of living darkness. Her face was beautiful in the way that a lightning strike is beautiful. Awesome, terrible, and utterly inhuman in its perfection. And her eyes, glowing with inner fire the color of fresh blood, fixed on Matthias with an intensity that made him feel as if his soul was being weighed and found wanting. Behind him, he heard both Serafina and Evangeline inhale sharply, twin sounds of dread and resignation. The queen's gaze swept past him, found her daughters, and her expression shifted from regal fury to something far more complex. Disappointment, wounded pride, and an anger that ran so deep it had become cold and precise. "Why?" Queen Carmilla said, and her voice was like the tolling of bells in a tomb, resonant and absolute. "Are my vampire daughters sheltering in your cabin human?" Each word fell into the space with the weight of a pronouncement, as if the very act of speaking made reality conform to her will. Matthias found himself unable to look away from those crimson eyes, though every instinct screamed at him to avert his gaze, to fall to his knees, to beg for mercy. He was mortal, ephemeral, a candle flame confronted by the sun. What could he possibly say that would matter to a being of such ancient power? "They sought sanctuary," he said, and was surprised to find his voice steady. "I offered it. That's the sum of it." The queen's eyes narrowed and she stepped fully into the cabin. The walls seemed to expand to accommodate her presence, or perhaps it was simply that space itself bent around her, unwilling to constrain her. "You offered sanctuary to fugitives from royal justice? Do you understand the position you have placed yourself in, mortal? You have interfered in a matter of vampire law. The punishment for such presumption is death. Slow, creative, and entirely deserved." "Mother, please." Serafina stepped forward, placing herself between Matthias and the queen. "He is innocent of any crime. He did not know who we were when he offered aid. Punish us if you must, but leave him out of this. He is just a human who showed kindness to strangers." "Just a human," Carmilla repeated, and something that might have been amusement flickered in her expression. As if that simple phrase explains anything. Humans are never just anything. They are chaos incarnate, forever disrupting the careful order of things with their notions of mercy and justice and other sentimental nonsense. Her gaze returned to Matthias. "What is your name, human who offers sanctuary to those hunted by their own queen?" "Matthias Blackwood," he replied. "And I make no apologies for offering shelter to those who needed it. If that's a crime by your laws, then your laws are unjust." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Somewhere in the distance, a tree fell in the forest, its crash echoing through the stillness. Carmilla's expression remained unreadable, but the temperature in the cabin dropped another few degrees, frost forming on the wooden beams. Then she laughed. It was not the reaction Matthias had expected. The sound was rich and genuine, tinged with something that might have been respect or possibly just amused disbelief that a mortal would dare lecture her on justice. "Insolent," she said, but the word lacked heat. "Foolish. Brave in the way that ignorance of consequences breeds bravery. You remind me of someone I knew once, long ago." The amusement faded from her face, replaced by the cold calculation of a monarch considering a particularly complex problem. "Very well, Matthias Blackwood. You have inserted yourself into this affair, and so you shall see it through to its conclusion. I declare a wedding battle." "Mother, no." Evangeline tried to rise from where she lay wounded, but Serafina held her back. "A wedding battle?" Matthias looked between the three vampires, utterly lost. "What is that?" Carmilla smiled, showing fangs that gleamed like polished ivory. "An ancient rite, even older than the wedding hunt. When a champion emerges to defend those fleeing an arranged marriage, the champion may challenge the suitor to ritual combat. If the champion prevails, the marriage is dissolved and the refugees go free. If the champion falls, the marriage proceeds as planned, and the champion's life is forfeit." She tilted her head, studying Matthias with the intensity of a cat examining a mouse. "You have defended my daughters, offered them sanctuary despite the danger. By the old laws, that makes you their champion, whether you intended such a role or not." "That's insane," Matthias said flatly. "I'm a human. Your daughters are vampires. How am I supposed to be anyone's champion in a fight against other vampires?" "That," Carmilla replied, is what makes it interesting. The wedding battle does not require the champion to be of any particular race or station. The law says only that a champion who offers sanctuary may challenge for the right of refusal. You have offered sanctuary. Therefore you may challenge. She paused and her smile grew sharper. Or you may withdraw your offer of sanctuary, ask my daughters to leave, and this entire matter becomes moot. They will be taken, married to the Obsidian princes, and your involvement will be forgotten. It was a test, Matthias realized. Not just of courage but of character. The queen was giving him an escape route, a way to avoid being crushed in the gears of immortal politics. All he had to do was withdraw his protection, send the two wounded vampires back out into the night to face whatever fate their mother had decreed. It was the sensible choice, the survival choice, the choice that would let him return to his quiet life of solitude and isolation. He looked at Seraphina and Evangeline, saw the resignation in their eyes, the expectation of betrayal. They had already accepted that this human, like all mortals when confronted with real power, would fold and save himself. And something in that acceptance, that weary lack of surprise at being abandoned, made his decision for him. I don't withdraw anything, Matthias said. If challenging means they have a chance to choose their own fates, then I challenge. Tell me what I have to do. Carmilla's expression shifted, and for the first time, Matthias saw genuine surprise in those ancient eyes. You understand that you will almost certainly die? The Obsidian princes are warriors with centuries of experience. They have slain dragons human. They have led armies in the blood wars. You are a woodsman with a bow. This is not a tale where the plucky mortal triumphs through heart and determination. Maybe not, Matthias agreed. But it's a tale where a mortal at least tried to stand for something right. That seems like enough. The vampire queen stared at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her demeanor. The cold fury that had filled the cabin began to recede, replaced by a contemplative stillness. You are either the bravest human I have encountered in 5 centuries or the most foolish. I have not yet determined which. She gestured, and the shattered remains of the door reformed themselves, flowing back together like water running in reverse. The wedding battle will take place at sunset tomorrow in the Thornwood clearing. That gives you 1 day to prepare, champion. I suggest you use it wisely. My daughters will remain here under your protection until then. I will send word to the Obsidian princes that their brides-to-be have found a champion, and they must face him before their claim can be validated. Mother, Seraphina said, her voice thick with emotion Matthias could not quite parse. Why are you allowing this? You wanted these marriages. You planned them for years. Why not simply end this now? Carmilla turned to her daughter, and for the first time, Matthias saw past the terrible majesty to the being beneath, ancient, weary, and perhaps more conflicted than her regal bearing suggested. Because I am reminded, she said quietly, that I too was once young and furious at the idea of having my life dictated by the needs of state. And because this human has shown more courage and principle in 5 minutes than most immortals display in a century. If he somehow survives tomorrow's battle, perhaps my daughters have chosen their path more wisely than I have chosen mine for them. She looked back at Matthias. But make no mistake, mortal. The Obsidian princes will show you no mercy. They view this as insult layered upon insult. First the rejection of their suit and now to be challenged by a human? They will make your death an artistic statement. Comforting, Matthias muttered. Carmilla's laugh was softer this time, almost fond. Prepare yourself, Matthias Blackwood. Pray to whatever gods you believe in. Make your peace with the world. And perhaps, if you are very lucky and the universe is feeling whimsical, you will survive to see another dawn. With that, she turned and stepped out into the night. Her wings unfurled to their full, impossible span, and she launched herself into the darkness, the sound of her departure like thunder rolling across the mountains. The cabin felt smaller and dimmer after her departure, as if some fundamental source of energy had been removed. Matthias stood in the restored doorway, his hands shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror, trying to process what had just happened. He had challenged vampire princes to ritual combat. He, a human woodsman whose greatest accomplishment was surviving 12 years in the wilderness alone, was supposed to face immortal warriors in battle tomorrow. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it were not so immediately, lethally real. "You should not have done that," Evangeline said from where she lay. Her voice was weak but clear. "You should have sent us away. You've signed your own death warrant for 2 vampires you don't even know." "Probably," Matthias agreed, turning back to face them. "But I couldn't do anything else. Not and still live with myself after." Serafina approached him, and in her eyes he saw a swirl of emotions: gratitude, guilt, wonder, and something else he could not quite name. "Then we will ensure your sacrifice means something," she said. "You may be mortal, and this may be a hopeless fight, but we are daughters of the Crimson Court. If you are to be our champion, then we will prepare you as best we can. You will not walk into that clearing defenseless." The rest of that night and all the next day became a compressed course in vampire combat doctrine, delivered by 2 immortal princesses who alternated between grudging respect for their unexpected champion and frank discussions of how quickly he was likely to die. Serafina and Evangeline, once Evangeline's wound had stabilized enough for her to move, transformed Matthias's cabin into an impromptu war room and training ground. They began with assessment. Serafina had Matthias demonstrate his skills: bow work, knife work, hand-to-hand fighting such as it was. She watched with the critical eye of someone who had been training in combat since before his great-great-grandfather was born, and her verdict was politely devastating. "You're competent for hunting animals," she said. "But animals don't fight back with strategy. Against a vampire warrior, your techniques are suicide. We need to rebuild your entire approach to combat in," she glanced at the sky outside, calculating, "less than 12 hours. No pressure." The training that followed was brutal and enlightening in equal measure. Evangeline, despite her injury, proved to be the more patient instructor, breaking down vampire combat theory into digestible concepts. "You're thinking of this as a fair fight," she explained. "It's not. It was never going to be fair. Forget everything you know about honorable combat. You need to think like an assassin, like prey that suddenly turns on the predator. Your advantages are surprise, creativity, and the fact that they will underestimate you until the moment you kill them, if you can kill them." "If?" Matthias asked, practicing a strike pattern Serafina had just shown him for the dozenth time. "Vampires are difficult to kill," Evangeline explained clinically. "Decapitation works. Complete incineration works. Destruction of the heart works, but it must be thorough. A simple stab won't suffice. Massive trauma can incapacitate us temporarily, but we heal. Sunlight is lethal but slow unless the exposure is prolonged. You need to know exactly where and how to strike, and you need to be fast enough that they don't simply dodge your attack and kill you during the follow-through." They taught him about vampire physiology, the way their supernatural speed worked in bursts rather than continuously, the momentary vulnerabilities in their guard during those explosive movements. Serafina demonstrated their thought patterns in combat, the way centuries of experience made them both incredibly skilled and occasionally predictable. "Older vampires develop preferred strategies," she said. "Repeated over centuries they become ingrained. The Obsidian Princes favor overwhelming force and direct assault. They're powerful enough that it usually works. That's your edge. They won't expect subtlety from a human, and they won't adapt quickly to unconventional tactics." As the sun climbed toward its apex, they moved from theory to practice. Matthias's cabin had a small clearing beside it, and there Serafina drilled him mercilessly, moving at what she claimed was barely above human speed, while he tried to track her movements and find openings. It was humbling and terrifying to realize just how outmatched he was. Even when she slowed herself down, she flowed through combat like water, each movement precise and economical. "Stop thinking about what I'm doing," she instructed, easily sidestepping his attempted strike. "Start thinking about where I have to be next. Combat is about reading patterns, predicting movement. I'm telegraphing my attacks significantly for your benefit. Watch my shoulders, my hips, they show direction before the limbs commit." By midday, Matthias was exhausted, bruised, and had developed a profound respect for just how formidable his unexpected house guests truly were. But he had also begun to internalize some of what they were teaching him. Not mastery, that would take years or decades he did not have. But enough to maybe, possibly, if fortune smiled on him and the universe decided to be kind, survive more than 30 seconds in the Thornwood clearing. They broke for a meal, and it was during this strange interlude, two vampire princesses watching a human eat bread and dried meat, discussing strategy for an impossible battle, that the conversation turned more personal. Matthias found himself curious about his unlikely allies, about what kind of beings chose to flee rather than submit to their mother's dictates. "Why does marriage matter so much?" he asked. "I mean, you're immortal. Can't you just wait out the arrangement, let a few decades pass and then dissolve it?" Serafina and Evangeline exchanged glances, and it was Evangeline who answered. "Vampire marriages are not like human unions. They are blood bonds, magical compacts that tie the participants together for as long as both exist. Once made, they cannot be broken except by the death of one partner. And within the bond, the older, more powerful vampire has certain authorities over the younger one. The Obsidian Princes are each over 800 years old. We are barely 300. In a blood bond with them, we would become extensions of their will, our autonomy eroded over the centuries until we were little more than especially powerful possessions." "That's monstrous," Matthias said flatly. "That's tradition," Serafina replied with equal flatness. "Ancient, respected, and utterly barbaric. Our mother believes she is acting in the best interests of the Crimson Court, forging alliances that will ensure our survival for the next millennium. She's not wrong about the political benefits. She's just wrong about the cost being acceptable." "So you ran?" Matthias said. "So we ran," Evangeline confirmed. "Knowing that we would probably be caught, that our defiance would only delay the inevitable. But at least we would have tried. At least we would have fought." She met his eyes across the small table. "Which is exactly what you're doing for us now. Fighting a battle you cannot win because the alternative is unacceptable. We understand you, Matthias Blackwood, better than you might think." As afternoon wore into evening, there was little left to teach and much to consider. Serafina and Evangeline had shared every tactical insight they could, had drilled Matthias until his muscles screamed and his reflexes had sharpened to the finest edge achievable in such limited time. But all three of them knew the truth that none would speak aloud. It would not be enough. Matthias was still human, still bound by mortal limitations no amount of training could overcome in a single day. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, Serafina presented Matthias with a bundle wrapped in dark cloth. "We cannot give you our speed or our strength," she said quietly, "but we can give you this." She unwrapped the bundle, revealing a sword. It was beautiful in the way that weapons of war can be, elegant and terrible. The blade was a pale silvery metal that seemed to glow with inner luminescence, etched with the same kind of runes that had adorned Queen Carmilla's armor. The crossguard was worked in a spiral pattern, and the grip was bound in black leather worn smooth by centuries of use. "This is Nightfall," Evangeline explained. "It belonged to our father, King Valdis, before his death 3 centuries ago. He was human once, before our mother transformed him out of love, and he had this blade forged by the dwarf smiths of the northern holds. It is steel folded with silver, blessed by old magic, and it has tasted the blood of vampires before. Against mortals it is merely an excellent sword. Against immortals it is death itself." Matthias took the weapon, feeling its perfect balance, the way it seemed to settle into his hand as if forged specifically for his grip. "This is beyond price," he said. "I can't accept this." "You already have," Serafina said firmly. "You accepted when you offered us sanctuary. You accepted when you stood against our mother and declared yourself our champion. This is not a gift, Matthias. This is your right as our father's successor in spirit. He too was a mortal who stood against the darkness when he had every reason to flee from it. You honor his memory by carrying his blade." There was nothing Matthias could say to that, no words adequate to the moment. So he simply nodded, strapped the sword across his back, and tried to ignore the weight of expectation that came with it. As the last rays of sunlight faded and the first stars emerged in the darkening sky, they left the cabin and began the journey to Thornwood Clearing. It was not far, perhaps 30 minutes' walk through the forest along a game trail Matthias knew well. But every step felt weighted with finality, as if he were walking toward the edge of the world with nothing but void beyond. The Thornwood Clearing was a natural amphitheater in the forest, a perfect circle perhaps 100 feet across where the trees drew back and the ground was carpeted in moss and fallen leaves. Moonlight poured into the space like silver water, illuminating the scene with stark, beautiful clarity. And waiting there, standing with the patience of those for whom time is an endless resource, were the Obsidian Princes. Lucian and Dreven were twins, identical in appearance and equally formidable in presence. They stood well over 6 feet tall, armored in black plate that seemed to drink in light rather than reflect it. Their faces were sharp and cruel, handsome in the way that predators are handsome, admirable for their perfection but terrifying for what that perfection enabled. Their eyes glowed with the same crimson fire as Queen Carmilla's, though in their gaze, Matthias saw none of the complex calculation he had glimpsed in the Queen. There was only contempt, amusement, and the anticipation of violence. Queen Carmilla was also present, standing at the edge of the clearing with several other figures Matthias did not recognize, members of the Crimson Court, he assumed, witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. The Queen's expression was unreadable as Matthias, Seraphina, and Evangeline entered the clearing and took their positions. "So," Lucian said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to resonate from the earth itself, "this is the human who thinks to deny us our brides. How quaint." He looked Matthias up and down with undisguised scorn. "I almost admire the courage it takes to walk willingly to your death. Almost. Mostly I'm just offended that you exist and have wasted my time." "The feeling's mutual," Matthias replied, and was rewarded by a flash of anger in Lucian's eyes. "Good." Angry opponents made mistakes. Dreven stepped forward and his smile was a predator's expression, all teeth and hunger. "The rules of wedding battle are simple, human. You fight us both simultaneously. If you manage to kill us both before we kill you, the marriage contracts are dissolved and the daughters of Carmilla are released from their obligations. If we kill you, when we kill you, the marriages proceed immediately, and your corpse will serve as a reminder to others who might think to interfere in the affairs of immortals." "Both of you at once?" Matthias looked between them. "That doesn't seem particularly sporting." "Wedding battles are not about sport," Carmilla said from the edge of the clearing. "They are about determination of worth. If you cannot defeat the suitors, then you are not worthy to be champion, and your sanctuary means nothing." She raised her hand and the assembled vampires fell silent. "Let it begin." The Obsidian Princes moved with speed that defied human comprehension, crossing the distance between them and Matthias in the space between heartbeats. But Matthias was already moving, throwing himself to the side in a roll that Seraphina had drilled into him until it was pure muscle memory. Lucian's clawed hand swept through the space where Matthias's throat had been an instant before, and then Matthias was up, nightfall drawn and cutting in a silver arc toward Dreven's exposed side. The blade connected and Dreven screamed. It was a sound of genuine pain and shock, the cry of a predator discovering that prey has teeth. Silver fire erupted from the wound, eating into vampire flesh with the viciousness of concentrated sunlight. Dreven staggered back and Matthias pressed his advantage, striking again, but Lucian was there, his armored forearm deflecting the blow with a shriek of metal on metal. "Silver blade," Lucian snarled, and the contempt in his eyes had been replaced by wariness. "And blessed by the feel of it. Clever little mortal. It won't save you." The battle became a desperate dance of survival and opportunity. Matthias had no illusions about his chances in a prolonged fight. The princes were stronger, faster, and possessed of centuries of combat experience. His only hope was to exploit moments of vulnerability, to strike when they overextended, to use their underestimation of him as a weapon. Seraphina and Evangeline watched from the edge of the clearing, unable to intervene by the rules of the wedding battle but calling out warnings when they could, alerting Matthias to attacks coming from his blind spots. Their voices became a lifeline, a thread of assistance in a battle that was otherwise horribly one-sided. Dreven, recovered from the initial wound, attacked with renewed fury. His claws extended to impossible lengths, razor-edged and coated with some dark substance that Matthias instinctively knew was poison. He dodged and wove, using the terrain of the clearing to his advantage. The exposed roots, the uneven ground, anything that might trip up his supernatural opponents or give him a moment's advantage. Nightfall sang through the air, and wherever it cut, vampire flesh burned. Matthias scored a deep gash across Lucian's thigh, opened a wound in Dreven's shoulder, each strike buying him seconds of breathing room as the princes recoiled from the silver-blessed steel. But for every wound he inflicted, they inflicted 3 in return. Claws raked across his back, drawing blood and sending white-hot pain lancing through his body. A backhanded strike sent him sprawling, and only Nightfall, thrust blindly upward, kept Dreven from following up and ending the fight. "You're going to die tired," Lucian taunted, circling like a wolf looking for an opening. "All you're doing is prolonging the inevitable. Accept your death with dignity." "Dignity's overrated," Matthias gasped, using the moment to catch his breath. He could feel blood soaking through his clothing, could taste copper in his mouth. How long had they been fighting? Minutes? Hours? Time had become elastic, each second stretching and compressing based on proximity to death. Then Dreven made a mistake. It was small, a moment of overconfidence born from centuries of victories and the assumption that a wounded human was a dead human. He lunged forward in a straight-line attack, expecting Matthias to try to dodge backward to create distance. Instead, Matthias stepped forward into the attack, inside Dreven's guard where those terrible claws could not effectively strike. Nightfall came up in a two-handed grip, driven by every ounce of strength Matthias possessed, and the silver-blessed blade punched through the black armor and into Dreven's chest cavity where his heart resided. Dreven's eyes went wide with shock and disbelief. Silver fire exploded through his body, burning from the inside out. He opened his mouth to scream, to curse, to call for his brother, but only ash emerged. In seconds, the ancient vampire crumbled, his body unable to sustain itself against the combined assault of silver and sacred steel. His armor clattered to the ground, empty, and a wind swept through the clearing, scattering his remains like so much dust. The silence that followed was absolute. Every vampire in the clearing stared at the spot where Dreven had stood, unable to process what had just occurred. A human had killed a prince of the Obsidian Dominion. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. It was done. Lucian's roar of rage and grief shattered the stunned silence. He came at Matthias with abandon, all technique forgotten in the face of loss and fury. But fury made him sloppy, made him vulnerable. Matthias, operating now on pure instinct and the training Seraphina had beaten into him, met the charge with Nightfall extended. The blade took Lucian in the throat, and the ancient vampire's momentum carried him forward, impaling himself on the silver steel even as his claws found Matthias's chest and tore deep, seeking his heart. They fell together, vampire and human, locked in a final embrace of mutual destruction. Matthias felt Lucian's claws scrape against his ribs, felt his own life's blood pumping out to join the ashen remains of the first prince. The pain was distant now, his body going into shock and shutting down non-essential sensory input. He watched with detached fascination as Lucian's face, so close to his own, contorted with rage and pain and then began to flake away, disintegrating as the silver poison spread from the catastrophic wound in his throat. "Impossible," Lucian whispered with his final breath. "You're just human." "Yeah," Matthias agreed, his own voice barely audible. "But humans are stubborn like that." Then Lucian was ash, and Matthias was lying on the moss and leaves of Thornwood clearing, staring up at the stars and thinking that they were very beautiful and it was not such a bad place to die. He heard screaming, Seraphina's voice or maybe Evangeline's calling his name. Felt hands on him, pressure being applied to wounds that were probably too severe to matter. The faces of the vampire princesses swam into view above him, both of them crying tears that sparkled like rubies in the moonlight. "You did it," Seraphina was saying over and over like a prayer. "You actually did it. You won. You gave us our freedom." "Good," Matthias managed to say. The world was growing dim at the edges, a comfortable darkness creeping in. "Make it count. Live lives worth this." "No," Evangeline said fiercely. "You don't get to die. We won't allow it." She looked up, and Matthias followed her gaze to see Queen Carmilla standing over them all, her expression complex and unreadable. "Mother," Evangeline pleaded. "Please. He's dying because of us, because he honored his word and fought for our freedom. Don't let him die. Transform him." Carmilla was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, contemplative. Transformation is not given lightly. It is a gift and a curse, a death and a rebirth. He would lose his humanity, gain immortality and power, but never again see the sun or taste mortal food or know the simple pleasures of the life he has lived. He'd be alive, Serafina said. That seems like a place to start. The queen knelt beside Matthias, and her ancient eyes met his fading gaze. The choice is yours, Matthias Blackwood. I can let you die here, a hero who saved 2 immortal princesses and defeated 2 ancient vampires in fair combat. Your name will be legend, sung in ballads for centuries. Or I can offer you the blood gift, transform you into one of us, and you will live forever but never again as a human. Choose quickly, for your time grows short. Matthias tried to think through the haze of pain and blood loss. Die a legend or live as a monster. Except, he had spent the last day and night with Serafina and Evangeline, and while they were certainly predators, they were not monsters. They were people, complex and contradictory and trying to navigate existence according to their own codes of honor. Was that so different from humanity? If I choose transformation, he asked, his voice barely a whisper, will your daughters truly be free? No more forced marriages, no more using them as political pawns. Carmilla's smile was sad and knowing. You bargain even at the threshold of death. Yes, Matthias Blackwood. My daughters have proven themselves through their choice of champion. They are released from my plans for arranged marriage. They may choose their own paths, their own futures as they see fit. You have my word as Queen of the Crimson Court. Then I accept, Matthias said. Transform me. What followed was pain beyond anything he had experienced in the battle. Queen Carmilla's bite was not the sensual, gentle thing of romantic tales. It was efficient and brutal, her fangs punching through the meat of his neck to find the great artery there. She drank deeply, drawing out his life's blood with supernatural speed, and as his vision tunneled down to a pinpoint, she opened her own wrist with a claw and pressed it to his lips. Drink, she commanded. Take the blood gift and be reborn. The taste of vampire blood was indescribable, copper and roses, wine and lightning, life and death all mixed together. It burned its way down his throat and spread through his dying body like liquid fire, rewriting his flesh at a fundamental level. His heart, which had been stuttering to a stop, began to beat with new, impossible strength. His wounds, mortal moments before, began to close. His senses exploded outward, suddenly able to hear the individual heartbeats of every living thing within 100 yards, to smell the distinct scents of a dozen different plants and animals, to see in the darkness with perfect clarity. He died and was reborn in the space of minutes, his humanity shedding like a snake's skin to reveal something new and terrible and magnificent underneath. When he opened his eyes, they glowed with crimson fire, marking him as a newly made vampire and a member of the Crimson Court. Serafina and Evangeline helped him to his feet, and Matthias marveled at the steadiness of his limbs, at the complete absence of pain from wounds that should have crippled him. He looked down at his hands and saw pale, perfect skin, unmarred by the scars and calluses of his human life. He was transformed, changed fundamentally, and the implications of what that meant would take time to fully process. Welcome to immortality, Carmilla said, and her tone was formal, the queen addressing a new subject. You are now Matthias of House Blackwood, vampire of the Crimson Court, and champion to my daughters. You have earned a place in our society through blood and courage. Use your new existence well. Matthias turned to Serafina and Evangeline, these 2 vampire princesses for whom he had risked and ultimately sacrificed his humanity. They looked at him with expressions of wonder, gratitude, and something that might have been the beginning of genuine affection born from shared ordeal. So what happens now? He asked, his voice carrying new resonances, new harmonics. Serafina smiled, and it transformed her face from beautiful to radiant. Now we teach you how to be a vampire. How to hunt without killing, how to move through society, how to use the powers that are waking within you. It will take decades to fully master. Decades? Matthias repeated, testing the word. He had decades now, centuries even, stretching out before him in an endless road. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. And after you've learned control, Evangeline added, we figure out what to do with our freedom. Mother has released us from her plans, but that just means we have to make our own plans. Build our own futures. We've never had that before. Queen Carmilla turned to leave, her wings spreading in preparation for flight. But she paused and looked back at her daughters and their unexpected champion. One more thing, she said. The wedding battle was fought for the right of refusal, the right for my daughters to choose their own partners or choose none at all. But I wonder, Matthias Blackwood, whether you realize the full implications of what you have done. Her smile was enigmatic, ancient, and perhaps a touch mischievous. By the old laws, a champion who successfully defends fugitives from arranged marriage becomes bound to those he has defended. Not through compulsion but through honor. You have given my daughters the freedom to choose their own fates. I wonder if they will choose you. With that cryptic statement, the queen launched herself into the night sky, and the assembled vampires of the Crimson Court followed, leaving Matthias alone in the clearing with Serafina and Evangeline. There was a moment of silence, heavy with unspoken implications. Then Evangeline laughed, a sound of pure, unfettered joy. Leave it to Mother to have the last word even when granting us autonomy. She's right though. The old laws do bind champion to defend it through ties of honor. Though they say nothing about what form those ties must take. Serafina stepped closer to Matthias, and in her eyes he saw genuine warmth, the barrier she had maintained as a princess and a warrior lowering for the first time. We have centuries to figure out what we are to each other, she said softly. Champion and defended, certainly. Friends, I hope. Perhaps, eventually, something more. But whatever we become, know that you gave us the most precious gift imaginable, the freedom to choose. That is not a debt that can ever be fully repaid. Matthias looked between the two vampire princesses, at the clearing where he had died and been reborn, at the night forest that was now his eternal home. He thought about his cabin, his solitary life, the quiet existence he had built after tragedy had driven him to isolation. All of that was gone now, transformed as thoroughly as his flesh. But in its place was something new. Purpose, perhaps. Connection. A life, or rather an immortal existence, that promised complexity and challenge and the chance to matter in ways he had never imagined when he was just a woodsman with a bow. I chose to offer sanctuary, he said finally. Not for reward or recognition but because it was right. If what comes after is friendship or partnership or something more, then that's a gift I never expected. Let's take this one night at a time and see what we can build together. Serafina and Evangeline exchanged glances, and then both smiled, genuine expressions of hope and possibility. One night at a time, Evangeline agreed. For immortals with all the time in the world, that sounds perfect. They left the Thornwood clearing together as the moon reached its apex, three vampires walking side by side into a future that none could have predicted mere days before. Behind them, the ashes of the Obsidian Princess scattered on the wind, a reminder that even in a world of immortals, courage and principle could still change the course of fate. In the halls of the Crimson Court, the tale would be told for centuries, the story of the human woodsman who became a vampire champion, who stood against impossible odds and won, who gave two princesses the freedom to write their own stories. It would become legend, embellished and expanded with each retelling until the true details were buried beneath layers of myth. But the truth, as it always is, was simpler and more profound than any legend. A solitary man had made a choice to help those in need, knowing it would cost him everything. And in losing his humanity, he had gained something immeasurably precious, a place in the world, a purpose greater than mere survival, and the companionship of two extraordinary beings who would walk beside him through the endless nights to come. As dawn approached and the three vampires returned to Matthias's cabin, now to be shared, a sanctuary transformed into a home, the first rays of sunlight broke over the eastern peaks. They closed the shutters against the lethal light, sealing themselves into the protective darkness, and Matthias experienced his first true vampire sleep, a dreamless rest that would carry him through the daylight hours until night returned and his new existence could continue. Outside, the forest carried on with its eternal cycles, indifferent to the dramas of immortals and the transformation of a solitary woodsman into something more. Birds sang their morning songs, deer browsed in the clearings, and the mountain streams continued their ancient flow toward distant seas. The world turned as it always had and always would, but within one small cabin on the northern frontier, everything had changed. And so ended one story and began another, A tale of chosen family, of freedom earned through sacrifice, of the strange and unexpected paths that life, and unlife, can take when courage meets compassion at the crossroads of fate. For Matthias, Serafina, and Evangeline, it was only the beginning. The centuries stretched ahead, full of possibility and promise, each night a new chapter waiting to be written in the endless book of immortal existence. In the halls of the Crimson Court, Queen Carmilla sat upon her throne of black stone and crimson cushions, a small smile playing at the corners of her ancient lips. Her daughters had their freedom, yes, but they also had something far more valuable, a companion who had proven his worth beyond doubt, who had chosen honor over survival and love over self-preservation. If that was not the foundation for something lasting and profound, then she had not lived for over 1,000 years learning the nature of immortal hearts. Perhaps, she mused, her plan for her daughters' futures had not been derailed after all. Perhaps it had simply taken an unexpected turn, guided by forces even she could not have predicted. The arranged marriages to the Obsidian princes would have secured political alliances, true, but this new arrangement, voluntary, built on shared respect and the bonds forged in battle, this promised something far rarer in the immortal world. It promised genuine loyalty, the kind that could not be bought or commanded but could only be earned. She raised her goblet in a silent toast to the absent trio, to her daughters and their unlikely champion. To freedom, she whispered to the empty throne room, and to the courage to choose wisely when freedom is granted. May you build something worthy of the price that was paid for it. The goblet's contents glimmered crimson in the torchlight as she drank, and somewhere in the distant night, 3 vampires slept in companionable silence, safe in the knowledge that they had won something precious and rare, the right to write their own destinies together, one night at a time for all the countless nights to come.